shall find rest beyond the river.
Happy Sabbath. I want to thank the Lord for 35 years alive and healthy. He definitely has provided an abundance of travel protection this week, as school is now in session, and some of these people apparently haven't driven since the lockdown started. Anyway, I hope you all had a blessed week and enjoyed last week's video, thanks to the great production from Lineage Journey. Those 5-minute videos, they are great for work breaks, waiting at the doctor's office, or just taking a time out to try to change the pace of your thoughts. They're so interesting and well put together. Once again, I'm going to try to keep this video shorter, but if this is the start of a series, I'm going to do, by His grace, very thoroughly. I'm going to go against the critics of Ellen White and find out if their arguments are valid or not. I pray this will be enlightening for you as it has been for me so far. And I don't want to skip around or not address all the issues and come across as cherry-picking my arguments, so I will be addressing them in order. Non-EGW.org is the most comprehensive anti-EGW website I found, although there are smaller sites we might get to further down the road. The fact of the matter is, being for or against something taints your perception of things. The effect this election has had on people is a fantastic example of that. And yes, I am pro-Ellen White, and trust her writings is second only to the Bible. Thus, with the scriptures, though, we have a reference point and don't need to just go with feelings and opinions. She herself would tell you that's what she would want. I will do my best to incorporate scripture and the spirit of prophecy into a single tapestry of her teachings and life that blankets the actually cherry-picked errors of her detractors. I want to start with a quick 10-minute video that I feel will get us started on the right foot.
Yeah, Ellen White's corpus is vast, tens of thousands of pages, hundreds of thousands, millions and millions of words. So to try and say that there was one theme above all that was most important to her may seem a little controversial, but actually there was, and it was mission. But in addition to her general concern for mission, that is outreach, that she wanted every church member to witness to Jesus. But she had a particular passion within that, which was for foreign mission, overseas mission, what we might today call cross-cultural mission. That was the thing that concerned her above all. She comes back to it repeatedly. Yes, she writes about education, health, temperance, publishing, but these are all just methodologies. They're means to an end, and the end is that we lift Jesus up before the world, and indeed the end is the end of the world and the second coming of Jesus Christ. This is her great passion. We often forget that as well as traveling incessantly around the United States, she spent 2 years in Europe and 9 years in Australia. She was herself a long-term missionary. And that experience did shape her life and her attitudes, but this was always her great concern, and she was constantly aware that for the gospel really to go all around the world, people living in Christian areas had to take responsibility. And so her concern was that Adventists would put more and more effort into reaching what she doesn't use the term, but we would say unreached people groups, people of other world religions. And she actually says success in home mission depends on the reflex effect of foreign mission. So if we want to be successful in our homelands, we have to be reaching out to those people in the parts of the world who otherwise will never hear about Jesus Christ. Mission was so important to Ellen White, I think, partly because of her great love for Jesus Christ and her desire that people hear that good news. But also she has an apocalyptic understanding. A text that she keeps coming back to again and again is Matthew 24, which says, "This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then the end shall come." So not until then, in other words, which means church members, by our action or our inaction, have the capacity to hasten or to delay the second coming of Christ. So understanding that, and also in the context of Revelation 14, her attitude is, we have a duty. God is not going to, the second coming is not going to take place until the gospel of the kingdom has been preached in all the world. So it doesn't matter if we penetrate America or Australia or Europe, or indeed today we might say Brazil and the Philippines, which are the new sort of Christian strongholds. If we penetrate them more and more and more, and there's still billions of people in the 1040 window or in the great cities of Europe where people are now effectively godless, the second coming isn't going to take place. So we have to be reaching out to all the world. So she has this profound apocalyptic and soteriological understanding that says mission is essential, and from that she says, indeed, it's the responsibility of every church member. She will preach in sermons and say, every Seventh-day Adventist must ask himself and herself, how am I going to help take the gospel, preach the gospel of this kingdom in all the world as a witness for all nations? How am I going to do it? Of course, the ways of providence are impossible for us to discern. Was it God's plan for Ellen White to go to Australia, or did he just capitalize on it? I mean, how do we know? I'd certainly believe that providence is in control, but only at a macro level. We know from the history of Israel, God's people have a wonderful capacity to defy his will and really to mess things up. There's no question but the church leaders were quite pleased for Ellen White to go to Australia. It wasn't that they doubted her as a prophet, and in the 9 years she's there, whenever she writes to them, you read the minutes of General Conference sessions and annual councils. They read a letter from Ellen White, and people, oh, this is huge. So it's not that they doubt that she's a prophet, but a living prophet is rather more comfortable when she's several thousand miles away and it takes several weeks for a letter to reach you. And what prompted them asking her to go was the fact that she had received wisdom from God that she had to address the issue of race. The fact that the church in America and indeed elsewhere was racist, and she began to rebuke church leaders for this, and that was what made it too much. So I suspect that it may not have been God's plan for her to go to Australia, and that if church leaders had been more willing to listen, and had we had less prejudiced and bigoted attitudes, she may have stayed there. But who's to say? Because certainly God makes the most of that, and it's very important in Ellen White's own life. The experience of living in a different culture long term, I think, shapes her in very profound and important ways, and it gives the sense of importance that she had about mission an even greater impetus. What she does when she's in Australia is she begins to write more and more about the need for mission to go to non-Christians. Now, in the 1890s, Adventists essentially saw themselves as a revival movement within Protestantism. Adventism was taking the truth to Protestants. Pagans, animists, Muslims, forget it. Even Catholics were sort of like, well, we'll do a little bit, but all of these people just weren't on the radar. In the 1890s, it's when she's in Australia that Ellen White begins to write more and more and more and say, we have to go to China, we have to go to India, we have to go to Japan, we have to go to Ethiopia, we have to go to, as she says, the islands of the sea. In other words, the places where it's not just that they're not Protestants, they're not even Christians. And she is now pushing strongly, saying, we have to do mission to these people who otherwise will never hear the gospel. And I think that comes maybe partly because she herself has been thrown out of her homeland. Maybe it's because in Australia she's closer to Asia, she's closer to China and India. But whatever the reasons, it's while she's in Australia. In her 60s, when we often think people become more conservative, she actually became more radical, and there was a particular impetus for mission. So was it God's plan? Was it because of the hard hearts of church leaders? We don't know, but certainly God used it, and it made a huge difference in Ellen White's life and in the life of our church. Ellen White's writings about mission were extremely important in our history, because largely due to her, we made the transition from being a church that said we only need to reach North America. This is what we said in the 1860s and early 1870s. There are immigrants from many parts of the world in America, so to fulfill prophetic prophecies of preaching to all nations, we only need to preach to immigrants in North America. It's extraordinary when you think about it. But that was what Adventists said. So it's not that we hadn't thought about foreign mission. We'd thought about it and said, no, we don't need to do that. Ellen White helps change that, and then she helps change us again from being a church that's only focused on reaching Protestants to saying we have to reach truly people of all religions. So she makes a huge impact historically, but that's not all. because her writings still have relevance today. Because the truth is, China, India, these are still massive challenges to Christianity. We praise God for what we believe to be hundreds of thousands of Adventists in China and millions of other Christians. There's likewise hundreds of thousands of Adventists in India, but we're talking about as a percentage of 1 billion people in each of those countries, it's still a tiny, tiny percentage. And of course, when it comes to the Islamic world, we've been in the Middle East for over a century, and all we have to show for it are churches that are mostly empty. So the concern Ellen White identified in the 1890s and early 1900s in particular is still with us. All her counsel still applies to us. And the way that she saw for us to work, for example, she says we have to use young people. And she actually writes and says, of course, people will say, can we trust our young people to be leaders in missions work? She says, yes, you can. You have to train them. You have to give them appropriate education. But then give them the freedom to experiment. Make them the leaders, not just the foot soldiers. Make them the commanders and the captains. There's a radical testimony that was applicable then, and we still haven't completely followed through on today, so it's still applicable. And finally, there is her concept. She writes in one of her most moving passages, she says, we must take the good news of a Savior who loves people to everyone, and then she says it is their right. And I think very often we don't think it through, but if we do, we sort of assume it's their privilege. But she says it's not. It's their right. And it's our obligation to tell them, because if we don't, nobody will.
Her central message was spreading not her message or interpretations, but the message of biblical prophecy outlined more clearly in her books. There's a misconception that she's the mother of Adventism, but that's not so. Many fundamental Adventist beliefs were already well established before her writings came on the scene. I want you to notice in this series, though, how small and, I dare say, petty some of these arguments are. Although I will respect that the people behind this website might wholeheartedly think their arguments are solid, we will see they haven't dug deep enough and are twisting facts ever so slightly to prove incorrect arguments. I do hope some of their arguments, though, come across to you kind of as nitpicky as they do to me. I don't really mean to put it like that, but there's a few that just, I hope you see what I'm saying, that they're a little nitpicky. But still, we're going to go ahead and look into each one of them, because given the enormous scope of her writing, as mentioned in that little video, if her writings were not inspired, then there would be an Encyclopedia Britannica amount of errors you could find in her writings. But alas, her writings are wholly consistent with Scripture. Starting with the category Bible versus Mrs. White, and mind you, she was never versus the Bible, and she herself said if anything she wrote was contrary to the Bible, it should be disregarded. She never tried to add more to the Bible, and how very different than the attitude of many false prophets like Joseph Smith of Mormon fame, who added to the Bible with mysterious tablets only he could decipher and promoted polygamy. And cult leaders, we mentioned last week, only twisted scriptures and added to them. So under the Bible versus Mrs. White, the first category on the judgment we covered last week, and found that there is a judgment, EGW is correct. Let's start by breaking down 1.2, Signs of the End. They state that the Bible describes several distinct signs that will appear prior to Christ's return. The sun shall be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars of heaven shall fall, and the powers that are in heaven shall be shaken. And then shall they see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. Mark 13:24-26. And I beheld when he had opened the sixth seal, and lo, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood, and the stars of heaven fell unto the earth, even as a fig tree casteth her untimely figs, when she was shaken of a mighty wind. And the heaven departed as a scroll when it is rolled together, and every mountain and island were moved out of their places, and the kings of the earth, and the great men, and the rich men, and the chief captains, and the mighty men, and every bondman, and every free man, hid themselves in the dens and in the rocks of the mountains, and said to the mountains and rocks, Fall on us, and hide us from the face of him that sitteth on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb. Revelation 6:12-16. They say Ellen White that these signs were fulfilled in 1755, 1780, and 1833. Ellen White claims these signs have already been fulfilled. These signs were witnessed before the opening of the 19th century. In fulfillment of this prophecy, there occurred, in the year 1755, the most terrible earthquake that has ever been recorded. Great Controversy, page 304. May 19, 1780, stands in history as the Dark Day. Since the time of Moses, no period of darkness of equal density, extent, and duration has ever been recorded. Great Controversy, page 308. In 1833, the last of the signs appeared which were promised by the Savior as tokens of his second advent. The prophecy received a striking and impressive fulfillment in the great meteoric shower of November 13, 1833. That was the most extensive and wonderful display of falling stars which has ever been recorded. Great Controversy, page 308. Were these three events really a fulfillment of prophecy, or were they just naturally occurring events with no special significance? Let us examine the evidence below. The Lisbon earthquake of 1755. Mrs. White claimed this earthquake was the most terrible earthquake that has ever been recorded. In terms of destructive power, the Lisbon earthquake was neither the strongest nor the most destructive earthquake in history. Following is a list of the most destructive earthquakes in history. Now, we will come back to this list, but they go on to say, it is obvious that the Lisbon earthquake was not the most terrible earthquake that has ever been recorded. The most terrible earthquake was in China in 1556, which killed nearly 12 times as many people as the Lisbon earthquake. If one were to pick any earthquake on the above list as a sign of the end, the most likely candidate might be the 2004 earthquake and tsunami in Sumatra, Indonesia, which killed nearly 300,000 people. Not only did the Sumatra earthquake kill 4 times as many as the Lisbon earthquake, but it occurred 249 years closer to the return of Christ. Not only was the Lisbon earthquake not as destructive as other earthquakes, it was also less powerful. The Lisbon earthquake has been estimated to be a magnitude 8.7. Following is a list of 8 earthquakes of equal or greater magnitude since 1900. You can see there they have Chile in 1960, Alaska 64, Sumatra in 04. You can see the list on your screen. But if you notice, all these dates are after her death. But the 1960 earthquake in Chile was more than 7 times more powerful than the Lisbon earthquake. This is yet another evidence that the Lisbon earthquake was neither the most powerful nor the most destructive earthquake in history. How could an earthquake that occurred over a quarter of a millennium ago be a sign of Christ's soon return? Not only is it too far in the past to be a sign of the end, but it was less powerful and less devastating than many other earthquakes. So now let's break this down before moving on. As I was saying, firstly, the way they rank the earthquakes is slightly misleading, and that list of 8 earthquakes since the 1900s all happened many years and decades after her death. On the first list, they really should be in date order. Note the magnitude of 8.7 for Lisbon. So there are only 2 listed as higher magnitude, and they are 9.1 and 9.2, both happening in 2004 in Indonesia and the Indian Ocean respectively. She wasn't alive for those. And note there are 8 quakes with no recorded magnitude because the Richter scale wasn't invented until 1935, and prior to that, earthquake sizes were estimated based on damage done and how far away effects were felt using the Mercalli scale. Although this is barely more than guesswork, there are many written records of the earthquake in 1303. There isn't another instance of a recorded magnitude until the Lisbon earthquake. The Chinese quake in 1556 is recorded, quote-unquote, but the magnitude is not recorded. This is not proof of Ellen White lying or being wrong. Let's keep going and we'll discover how this all fits together into a much bigger picture that they are missing. The Dark Day of 1780. They go on to say, Mrs. White makes the following claim about the Dark Day on May 19, 1780. No period of darkness of equal density, extent, and duration has ever been recorded. Unlike earthquakes, dark days have not been measured for intensity, extent, and duration throughout history. It is difficult to ascertain the accuracy of Mrs. White's claim that there has not been a darker day since the supernatural darkness God brought upon the Egyptians during the time of Moses. However, we do know what caused the Dark Day of 1780. It was caused by smoke from huge forest fires burning in the New England states combined with a dark storm front passing through the area. The darkness was limited primarily to the northeastern area of the United States. Some within Adventism have raised the question as to whether this localized event was actually a fulfillment of the global prophecy of Revelation 6. There have been a number of dark days throughout history caused by smoke, storms, fog, sand, or volcanic ash in the air. A few historical examples from the Gallery of Natural Phenomena On April 12, 1910, darkness settled for 2 hours on Chicago, causing widespread terror among people who thought it was something to do with Halley's Comet. The weather department said it was a combination of rain, wind, and smoke. On April 30th, 1971, and mind you, much after her death, an ominous overcast at Jacksonville, Florida, blotted out almost all daylight for half an hour. Streetlights came on and birds went to roost. On October 24th, 1933, there was a midnight at midday in London when a high fog caused total darkness. On May 20th, 1857, in Baghdad, Iraq, a dust storm had been blowing all day when at about 5 p.m. a darkness set in that was deeper than the darkest night, and panic gripped the city. People looked for each other to see the end of the world together. On April 5th, 1766, an eruption in Hekla in Iceland produced a darkness so intense that people 50 leagues, about 150 miles away, had to grope their way about. 140 miles away, it was impossible to know whether a sheet of paper was white or black. Any or all of these events were just as impressive as the smoke event in New England in 1780, and most of them occurred much sooner to the return of Christ. So, here, the event is shown as Christ needs to come directly after it, or that it needs to be closer, just like they claimed about the earthquake. And they kind of played these off as like an isolated incident, but from the next article we can see it was much more than that. The Moon Phenomena of May 19, 1780, number 1, What Happened on That Fateful Day, by Richard E. Delafield, Pastor Evangelist, Texaco Conference, 1943. Under the sixth seal of Revelation 6, 4 great phenomena of nature were to occur. There was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood, and the stars of heaven fell. Revelation 6:12-13. We of the Second Advent movement understand when these 4 divinely appointed events occurred. They were to come in chronological order after the sixth seal was opened. The first phenomenon, of course, was the Lisbon earthquake of November 1st, 1755, and the last, the falling of the stars of November 13, 1833. Between these 2 events, a dual nature phenomena was to occur in the prophetic order of things. The sun was to be darkened, and the moon was to withhold her light. While in attendance at the Theological Seminary recently, I chose for my assignment in research technique the subject, an investigation of the moon phenomena of May 19, 1780. Considerable has been written and said regarding the great earthquake, the falling of the stars, and the dark day of May 19, 1780, but seemingly not too much study had been given to the actual phenomena of the moon, whether it appeared that night at all, its appearance as blood, and so forth. Further study seemed to be justified. Therefore I spent some time examining original as well as secondary source materials. The Library of Congress contained the volumes from which most of my material here is quoted. As suggested before, much more has appeared in print regarding the dark day than has come forth in regard to the terrible dark night that followed it. There is an abundance of evidence to show that the sun and moon phenomena occurred in connection with each other on May 19, 1780. For instance, in the Boston Gazette of May 29, 1780 appears a following statement which shows how the phenomena affected both sun and moon. There was the appearance of midnight at noonday. The wind in the evening passed round further north, where a black cloud lay, gave us reason to expect a sudden gust from that quarter. The wind brought that body of smoke and vapor over us in the evening at Salem, and perhaps it was never darker since the children of Israel left the house of bondage. This gross darkness held till about 1 o'clock, although the moon had fulled the day before. Between 1 and 2, the wind strengthened up at northeast and drove the smoke and clouds away, which had given distress to thousands and alarmed the brute creation. The Boston Gazette, referring to the attitude of several which was indicative of the intense darkness of that historic night, says further, "These gentlemen say the night was as remarkable as the day. One of them attempted to go to the barn to feed his horse, but found it impossible. I have also seen a very sensible captain of a vessel, who was that morning about 40 leagues southeast of Boston. Between 9 and 10 o'clock that night, he ordered his men to take in some of the sails, but it was so dark they could not find their way from one mast to another." Thomas Gage, no doubt an eyewitness of the event, writes in a year-by-year history of Raleigh, Massachusetts, "By 10 o'clock a.m. the darkness was such as to occasion farmers to leave their work in the field and retire to their dwellings. Fowls went to their roosts, and before noon lights became necessary to the transaction of business within doors. The darkness continued through the day and the night till morning, and is unusually dark as the day." It is not at all unlikely that Nathaniel Adams, from whom the following is taken, saw the phenomena of May 19, 1780. He writes, "The 19th of May, 1780, was remarkable for its uncommon darkness. The evening was enveloped in total darkness. The sky could not be distinguished from the ground. The clouds began to separate and the vapors to disperse a little before midnight, and some glimmerings of light appeared. The next morning was cloudy, but not unusually dark. The darkness extended throughout New England and was observed several leagues at sea. We quote now from a secondary source, a Saturday edition of the Journal of Literature and Politics of Portsmouth, Massachusetts. The dark day, May 19, 1780, is thus described by Mr. Stone in his History of Beverley. The night succeeding that day was of such pitchy darkness that in some instances horses could not be compelled to leave the stable when wanted for service. About midnight the clouds were dispersed, and the moon and stars appeared with unimpaired brilliancy. It will be recollected that the venerable Noah Webster, in speaking of this dark day, said that no cause had yet been assigned to it. Now comes perhaps the most thrilling account I found, interrupting a military episode of the greatest importance in the history of our country, dealing with General Washington, General Lafayette, Dr. Franklin, and Mr. J. Dr. William Gordon, a personal eyewitness of the scene of prophetic importance, takes leave of his narrative and gives his impressions of the dark day. This day has been rendered very remarkable by an extraordinary phenomenon, which demands a particular relation. About 8 at night, he, referring to himself, set out for home, after a special business session, not suspecting, but that being fully acquainted with every foot of the road, he should easily return, notwithstanding its being extremely dark. There were houses all the way, though at a considerable distance from each other. He marked the candlelight of one, and with that in his eye went forward till he got up to it, but remarked that the appearance of the place was so different from what was usual that he could not have believed it to be what it was, had it not been for his certain knowledge of its situation. He caught the light of a second house, which he also reached, and thus on. At length the light being removed from the last house he had gained sight of, ere he was up with it, he found himself in such profound darkness as to be incapable of proceeding, and therefore returned to the house he had passed and procured a lantern. Several of the company, having further to go, were on horseback. The horses could not see to direct themselves, and by the manner in which they took up and put down their feet on the plain ground appeared to be involved in total darkness, and to be afraid lest the next step should plunge them into an abyss. The gentlemen soon stopped at another tavern, and waited for the benefit of the moon, but after a while, finding that the air received no accession of light from it, note Matthew 24-29, when they were certain it had risen, they had recourse to candles to assist them in getting home. The shifting of the wind put an end to it, and at midnight it was succeeded by a bright moon and starlight. After a few more sentences, in which he explains the possible natural causes, owing to the clouds being highly charged with smoke, which had been collecting for days from the fires in the back country, he says, "Let us proceed to our military narrative." Even back then, we find people trying to use the smoke narrative, as it's natural for humans to want explanations for the unexplainable. No one mentions having a hard time breathing, or any kind of smell, but could God not use his holy smoke to bring about prophecy? I mean, he did live with the Israelites in a cloud of fire and smoke, and the Bible never said that the darkness had to be completely supernatural. And, I mean, he was a darkness that descended on Jerusalem immediately following the death of Christ. But now moving on to their last point, the meteor shower of 1833. Mrs. White describes the meteor shower of November 13, 1833 as the most extensive and wonderful display of falling stars which has ever been recorded. The 1833 meteor shower was an impressive event. In 1878, the historian R.M. Devens wrote, "During the 3 hours of its continuance, the day of judgment was believed to be only waiting for sunrise, and long after the shower had ceased, the morbid and superstitious still were impressed with the idea that the final day was at least only a week ahead. Impromptu meetings for prayer were held in many places, and many other scenes of religious devotion, or terror, or abandonment of worldly affairs transpired under the influence of fear occasioned by so sudden and awful a display." There is no denying that the 1833 shower was intense, and it had an effect upon some people. The question is whether the claim that the 1833 shower was the most extensive ever recorded is valid. In 1863, a Yale professor named Hubert Anson Newton identified the 1833 shower as being part of a recurring pattern of meteor showers that visited the Earth about every 33 to 34 years. Newton discovered that the Leonid showers began as early as 585 AD. He succeeded in tracing accounts of the Leonids for almost 1,000 years. Particularly impressive displays were found to have taken place in 1533, 1366, 1202, 1037, 967, 934, and 902. 34 years prior to 1833, on November 12th, 1799, Prussian scientist and explorer Alexander von Humboldt from his camp in Cumana, Venezuela, described the Leonid shower. No part of the sky so large as twice the moon's diameter was not filled each instant by meteors. An observer in Florida that same night noted that the meteors were at any one instant as numerous as the stars. While at Eiserstadt, Germany, bright streaks and flashes were seen even though day had already broken. Humboldt inquired among the South American natives and discovered that in 1766 a similar rain of stars had also been seen. In 1966, the Leonids returned with a display that rivaled the displays of 1799 and 1833. On the night of November 17, 1966, observers in Arizona reported rates as high as 2,400 per minute or 144,000 per hour. These reported rates surpassed the highest reported rates observed in 1833 at 100,000 an hour. Although observation science 133 years later was probably a little better, they go on to say, if the Leonid meteor showers are indeed a fulfillment of Bible prophecy, then one would have to conclude that it was the 1966 shower, not the 1833 shower, that fulfilled prophecy. Not only was the 1966 shower of equal or greater intensity, but it was also 133 years closer to the return of Christ. Unanswered questions. If the events of 1755, 1780, and 1833 were indeed fulfillments of prophecy, several questions are raised. 1. Why didn't the signs produce the effect described in the Bible? Revelation 6:15-16 describes the people who witnessed the signs as being panic-stricken. These people include kings and leaders of nations, are described as running to the mountains, hiding in dens, and asking for the mountains to fall on them. There is no evidence that the signs of 1755, 1780, and 1833 produced this effect. Although, I must say, if you read the accounts of what happened in Lisbon during the earthquake, it absolutely panicked everybody. It was a very horrible time. But number 2, why were the signs localized when the Bible seems to indicate a global scale? It says, while the signs described in the Bible appear to be global events, the 3 signs pointed out by Ellen White were on a seemingly smaller, localized scale. The Lisbon earthquake was limited to the Iberian Peninsula in northern Africa. The dark day was seen primarily in the northeastern United States. The Leonid meteor shower was perhaps the most widespread event, yet even it was seen only mostly in the Western Hemisphere. And number 3, why didn't those who witnessed the signs see the return of Christ? Mark 13:24-26 seems to indicate that those who see the signs of Christ's return will also witness his return. It says, then shall they, and notice they add, the ones who witnessed the signs. Now, I think they're having to add that because what they mean by they in that, they is the children of God. It's not the ones who witness the signs, it's they who are the children of God. Then they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. Mark 13:26. One of those who witnessed any of the signs mentioned by Ellen White are alive today. None of those. Yes, so the 1755 earthquake occurred 265 years ago. How could it be a sign of Christ's imminent return? Furthermore, Revelation 6:12-14 seems to indicate the signs will follow each other in fairly rapid succession. It appears that the same people who witnessed the earthquake also witnessed the darkness and the stars falling. Given the life expectancies of the era, it is unlikely that anyone old enough to have witnessed and remembered the Lisbon earthquake in Portugal in 1755 was still alive 78 years later, in 1833, to witness the Leonid meteor shower in North America. Furthermore, everyone who witnessed these signs died long ago. What good are signs of the end if those signs are not witnessed by the people living near the time of the end? These unanswered questions lead to the conclusion that the events of 1755, 1780, and 1833 could not possibly be the signs of the end described in Revelation 6:12-14. So let me quote a little bit more than they quoted earlier. Revelation 6:9-13 says, and when he had opened the 5th seal, I saw under the altar the souls of them that were slain for the word of God, and for the testimony which they held. And they cried out with a loud voice, saying, How long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not judge and avenge our blood on them that dwell on the earth? And white robes were given unto every one of them, and it was said unto them that they should rest yet for a little season, until their fellow servants also and their brethren that should be killed as they were should be fulfilled. And I beheld when he had opened the sixth seal, and lo, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood, and the stars of heaven fell unto the earth, even as a fig tree casteth her untimely figs when she is shaken of a mighty wind. Here we see the fifth seal of the persecution of the early Protestant reformers, and then mention of a brief rest period before the final death decree of Sabbath keepers in the last days. But you can see there is a sixth seal that is open they don't hardly mention in their argument against Ellen White. These things all needed to happen in a certain order. Exceedingly powerful earthquake, Lisbon 1755, dark day, moon like blood 1780, a star shower 1833. All this was the opening of the sixth seal leading up to Jesus entering the holy place in 1844. Here's what Stephen Bohr has to say from his Studies in Revelation, the Seven Seals, lesson number 7, the sixth seal, signs of the judgment. And I have a full PDF of this in a link so you can download it in the description on the video. Revelation 6:12-17. I looked when he opened the sixth seal, and behold, there was a great earthquake. The sun became black as sackcloth of hair. The moon became like blood, not darkened. And the stars of heaven fell to the earth, as a fig drops its late, unripe figs when it is shaken by a mighty wind. And the sky receded as a scroll when it is rolled up, and every mountain and island was moved out of its place. The kings of the earth, rulers who occupy thrones, the great men, high officers of the state, the rich men, socially wealthy, the commanders of armies, the mighty men, great men in battle, every slave and every free man, regular citizens, hid themselves. They are found naked according to Genesis 3:8, Revelation 16:15. In the caves and in the rocks of the mountains, and said to the mountains and rocks, Fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath is come, and who is able to stand? So, are the signs literal or symbolic? As Adventists, we take much of what the Revelation says symbolically. Why then do we understand the earthquake and the signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars to be literal? The answer is found in the meaning of a Greek word that is used 4 times in Revelation 6, 12, and 13, the word as, pos. Ranko Stefanovic says about the meaning of this word, the repeated usage of the word as or like in the text appears to be very significant. The sun becomes black as sackcloth, the moon as blood, the stars of the sky fall as do the figs of the fig tree, and heaven splits as the papyrus scroll. In Greek, this word introduces a figurative analogy to an actual event, which is compared with something figurative. This suggests that these heavenly signs are intended to be taken literally. It's from Ranko Stefanovic's Revelation of Jesus Christ, page 244. The link between the 5th and 6th seals, the plea of the martyrs of the Middle Ages, how long will you judge, in Revelation 6:10, is answered in Daniel 7:8-10, 8 and 13 and 14, where the process of judgment begins. According to these passages in Daniel, the trampling of the sanctuary and of God's people would last until the conclusion of the 2300 days, where the process of vindicating the sanctuary and its worshippers would begin. The signs in Revelation 6:12-13 are the announcement that the vindicating judgment is about to begin. It is noteworthy that the 6th church, the open door to the most holy place, the 6th seal, sealing the 144,000, and 6th trumpet, the vision of the Ark of the Covenant, all point to the events connected with the investigative judgment in the most holy place of the sanctuary. There are 2 earthquakes in the 6th seal. One is at the beginning of the 6th seal, and the other is at its end. The one at the beginning is described in verse 12, and the one at the end is described in verse 14. This second earthquake is further amplified in Revelation 16:18-20, where it is described as of cataclysmic proportions. In other words, the earthquake in Revelation 6:14 is the same one as in Revelation 16:18-20, where the context is the 7th plague. The earthquake in 6:12 is not the greatest in the history of the world like the one in 16:18. Only the greatest earthquake in history could remove mountains and islands from their places on a global scale. Purposes of the signs of Revelation 6:12-13, play several specific functions. First, they announce that the Great Tribulation is about to end, Matthew 24:29. Second, they serve as an omen of the fall of the papal power. Third, they serve to draw attention to the approaching judgment in 1844. Fourth, they serve as indicators of the beginning of the time of the end. Finally, they announce the soon coming of Jesus. Some critics within and without the church argue thus: how can you believe that events that took place 252, 227, and 174 years ago are signs of the soon coming of Jesus? Isn't this stretching credulity to its limit? On the surface, this argument seems persuasive until we look at the number of these years from a broader perspective. Let us suppose, for the sake of argument, that I am going to take a 6,000-mile trip. When I start the trip, we would all agree that my destination is far off. When I am halfway there, the destination is still far off. But would you agree that when I am 252 miles from my destination, or 227 miles from my destination, or 174 miles from my destination, that I am near? C. Mervyn Maxwell, in his excellent book, Magnificent Disappointment, page 91 and 92, puts 1844 and the nearness of the Second Coming in perspective. We need a change of perspective. Instead of looking back to 1844 and finding it around 150 years in the past, let us go back to the beginning of human history and view 1844 as almost 6,000 years in the future. From the perspective of Eden, at the beginning of Earth's 6,000 years, the remaining distance between 1844 and the 1990s is hardly discernible. These 150 years between 1844 and the 1990s represents only 1/40th or 2.5% of human history. More than 97% of human history took place prior to 1844. Yes, we are indeed in the end time. The final judgment began only yesterday, as it were. Christ's second advent is coming soon. The enemies of Adventism and of Ellen White have frequently pointed out that there have been other great earthquakes, dark days, and star showers in history. What makes the Lisbon earthquake, the dark day of 1780, and the Leonid star shower of 1833 unique? The answer is fourfold: location, order, time, and intensity. With regards to location, it is not coincidental that these signs appeared in Europe and in the United States. Europe, because there the deadly wound would be given to the papacy, and this would mark the end of the tribulation of 1260 days. The United States, especially New England, because there the messages of the judgment would be proclaimed powerfully by the Millerites beginning in the 1830s. Mervyn Maxwell states the location of the classic signs was highly significant. They happened in Europe and America primarily, where people were studying the Bible and pondering the prophecies. A dark day in the Sahara Desert or a star shower over New Guinea would have said little in those days about the second coming of Christ to cannibal headhunters or Muslim nomads. Events need not be universal to deliver a global message. A few square miles at Hiroshima and Nagasaki were sufficient to announce the atomic age. A stable in Bethlehem ushered in the Christian era. Only a few hundred people saw Jesus after his resurrection, but they told others. Magnificent Disappointment, pages 93 to 94. With respect to order, these phenomena occurred in history in the precise chronological order in which they are described in Revelation 6. The Lisbon earthquake in 1755, the dark day and the moon like blood in 1780, and the star shower in 1833. Show me one other instance in human history where these phenomena have taken place in this precise order within a period of less than 100 years. These signs also occurred precisely at the right time, precisely before the tribulation of the 1260 years came to an end, and immediately before the fulfillment of the prophecies concerning the fall of the papacy, 1798, and the beginning of the judgment, 1844. Concerning the intensity of these signs, Mervyn Maxwell has well stated, as recently as 1980, the widely respected seismologist G.A. Ibby, in Chapter 11 of his Earthquakes book, ranked the Lisbon earthquake as the largest shock ever, and reckoned that it may well have reached an almost incredible 9.0 on the Richter scale, 7 times stronger than the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. The dark day of May 19, 1780, has not been equaled in North America in the 200 years that have since come and gone. The Leonid shower of November 13, 1833, gave birth to a new branch of astronomy. Like the Lisbon earthquake and the famous dark day, it too has not been matched, in spite of scientific expectations that it would be. Magnificent Disappointment, page 93. Ellen White and the Sixth Seal. The first part of the sixth seal is in the Great Controversy, page 304 to 333. On page 304, Ellen White quotes Revelation 6:12, and on page 333, she quotes Revelation 6:13. She does not quote Revelation 6:14 to 17, the second part of the sixth seal, until pages 641 and 642. In order to comprehend this long parenthesis between the first and last part of the sixth seal, we must remember some things we studied under the fifth seal. The papacy has two stages of power, one past, during the 1260 years, and one future, at the very end of time. Therefore, the tribulation also has two stages, one past and one future. The past stage is the greatest in history with regards to length. The future stage is the greatest with regards to intensity. Regarding the first period of persecution, Ellen White remarks, "For more than 1,000 years, such persecution as the world had never before known was to come upon Christ's followers. Millions upon millions of his faithful witnesses were to be slain." Desire of Ages, page 631. The signs in the heavens also have two stages. The first group of cosmic signs announces the end of the first period of tribulation and the soon-to-begin judging portion of the fifth seal. The second set of cosmic signs announces the end of the second tribulation period and the avenging portion of the fifth seal. In between these 2 points of time, you have the vindicating judgment of the martyrs and the sealing of the 144,000 living saints. The first stage of the signs took place in 1755, 1780, and 1833. These signs showed that the first stage of persecution by the papacy was coming to an end and that the vindicating judgment was about to begin. These signs are referred to in Revelation 6:12 and 13 and Joel 2:31. The second stage of the signs will take place immediately before the second coming of Jesus and will mark the deliverance of the saints from the second stage of persecution by the papacy. These signs are described in Revelation 6:14 to 17. Two sets of signs. Will the signs of Revelation 6:12 to 13 have another fulfillment in the future? Absolutely not. In Joel 2:31 and in Revelation 6:12 to 13, we have two important details that distinguish these signs from the ones in the future. First, according to Joel 2:31, the signs of Revelation 6:12 to 13 occur before the great and terrible day of the Lord. Second, in the signs of Revelation 6:12 to 13, the moon is turned into blood and the stars fall from heaven, while in the signs of Revelation 6:14 to 17, the moon and the stars do not give their light. There is a second set of signs in the heavenly bodies which will be fulfilled when Jesus comes, and they are found in Joel 2:10, 11, Joel 3:15 to 16, and in Matthew 24:30. These signs take place as Jesus is preparing to leave heaven for earth. His coming is announced by the sun and moon being darkened and the stars not giving their light. There will also be a cosmic, global earthquake in heaven and on earth to announce his departure from heaven. The two sets of signs are different. Revelation 6:12 to 13, in these verses we are told that the moon became like blood, not that it was darkened. We were also told that the stars fell from heaven. These are not the same signs as those in Matthew 24, where the sun, moon, and stars are moved out of their places. The signs in Revelation 6:12 to 13 are similar to those in Joel 2:31. Also, Acts 2:20. Notice that the sun is darkened and the moon is turned into blood before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. Joel 2:10 to 11 depicts different signs than those in Revelation 6:12 to 13 and Joel 2:31. In the Joel passage, the earth and the heavens tremble, the sun and the moon grow dark, and the stars do not shine. These signs immediately precede the second coming of Jesus. Joel 3:15 to 16. Once again, we notice that these are not the signs spoken of in Revelation 6:12 to 13. Once again, we are told that the heavens and earth will shake, and the sun and moon will be dark, and the stars will not shine. Well, the stars sure did shine on November 13th, 1833. Isaiah 13:10 to 13. This passage is not parallel to Revelation 6:12 to 13. Here, the sun, the moon, and the stars are darkened. These things did not happen in 1755, 1780, and 1833. Notice that the heavens and the earth will be removed from their places. Notice that Revelation 6 presents the signs in the very order in which they occurred: an earthquake, the darkening of the sun, the moon becoming like blood, and the stars falling from heaven. The inevitable conclusion. The signs in Joel 2:31, Acts 2:20, and Revelation 6:12 to 13 are different than those in Matthew 24:30, Joel 2:10 and 11, Joel 3:15 and 16, and Isaiah 13:10. There is a difference between the expression "the time of the end" and "the end of time." Whereas the signs in Revelation 6:12-13 announce that we are entering upon the time of the end, the signs in Matthew 24:30 reveal that we have reached the end of time. Notice the entire passage of Matthew 24:29-31. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. He will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other, who are the powers of the heavens, in Matthew 24-29. Well, Genesis 1:16 tells us that the sun was made to rule the day, and the moon and the stars were made to rule the night. Early Writings, page 441, explains very well what will happen when the heavenly bodies, when Jesus comes. The powers of heaven are the sun, moon, and stars. They rule in the heavens. The powers of earth are those that rule on the earth. The powers of heaven will be shaken at the voice of God. Then the sun, moon, and stars will be moved out of their places. They will not pass away, but be shaken by the voice of God. Early Writings, page 41. The reason why the earth will be without form and void during the millennium is because of the global earthquake, and the reason why the heavens will have no light is because the sun and the moon and the stars will be moved out of their orbits. Ellen White and the signs, as we have stated before. White quotes Revelation 6:12-13 in the Great Controversy, page 304 and 333, and applies them to the signs that took place in 1755, 1870, and 1833. She does not quote Revelation 6:14-17 until pages 641 and 642. The heavens are rolled together as a scroll, the earth trembles before him, and every mountain and island is moved out of its place. And then she quotes verses 15-17. Why does she separate verses 12 and 13 from verses 14-17 by over 300 pages? Simply because she knew there was a long parenthesis of time between the events that are depicted in these passages. The principle is that there are signs which mark the end of the two stages of the tribulation. In both cases, the signs indicate that God has intervened to deliver his people and to bring the tribulation to an end. In the first instance, from the oppression of the 1260 years, and in the second instance, from the oppression of the time of Jacob's trouble. This must be understood in the context of the fifth seal. In the fifth seal, there are two groups of martyrs, one past and one future. The signs in the sixth seal, Revelation 6:12 and 13, are an announcement that the oppression of the first group of martyrs is about to come to an end. The signs of 6:14-17 are an announcement that the oppression of the second group of martyrs is about to come to an end, because God's people are going to be delivered by the voice of God, which causes the cosmic global earthquake and moves the sun, the moon, and the stars out of their places. Let's take a careful look at how Ellen White explains the signs of 1755, 1780, and 1833. Prophecy not only foretells the manner and object of Christ's coming, but presents tokens by which men are to know that it's near. Said Jesus, there shall be signs in the sun, and in the moon, and in the stars. Luke 21-25. The sun shall be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars of heaven shall fall, and the powers that are in heaven shall be shaken, and then shall they see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. Mark 13:24-26. The Revelator thus describes the first of the signs to precede the second advent. There was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood. Revelation 12. Great Controversy, page 304. It will be remembered that the question of the martyrs in the fifth seal has to do with two things, judging and avenging. The first part of the sixth seal answers the first part of this plea in heaven by the judgment. That is to say, the little horn would be judged after it trampled on the saints for 3.5 times. Part 1 of the sixth seal, 6:12-13, deals with the judge aspect. This part was announced by the great earthquake and the signs in the heavens, 6:12-13. The second part of the sixth seal, 6:14-17, deals with the second part of the martyr's plea, that is, the avenge aspect. This is discerned clearly in Revelation 6:17. The wrath of the Lamb will be poured out upon those who oppressed his people during the second stage of persecution. In between these two stages of the sixth seal, we have the judgment. First, we have the vindication of the martyrs who were slain, and then at the very end we have the sealing of the 144,000 living saints. For the living saints, the sealing of the 144,000 is the judging phase, Revelation 7:1-8, and the reward given to the great multitude is the avenging stage. Revelation 7:9-17. So we are living in the time of the sixth seal. There is nowhere that says those that witness the opening of the sixth seal will be alive to see his coming. Their argument is trying to separate these events and prove each one by itself proves nothing, but the chain of events up to 1844 proves it isn't the magnitude, but the timing. Even the magnitudes they had a hard time trying to bury in confusing charts that went more off death tolls than actual size. But this brings us to 1.3, the Day of Atonement, 1844 or Ascension. So Mrs. White and the Day of Atonement. When Christ failed to return as predicted in 1844, Adventists devised a teaching to try and explain that something important had actually occurred in 1844. Adventist pioneers concocted the idea that the heavenly Day of Atonement began in 1844, and Jesus moved from one room of the sanctuary to another room, shutting the door behind him. Ellen White writes, "This door was not opened until the mediation of Jesus was finished in the holy place of the sanctuary in 1844. Then Jesus rose up and shut the door of the holy place and opened the door into the most holy, and passed within the second veil, where he now stands by the ark, and where the faith of Israel now reaches. I saw that Jesus had shut the door of the holy place, and no man can open it, and he that had opened the door into the most holy place, and no man can shut it." Revelation 3:7-8. So when Christ entered the Holy of Holies to perform the closing work of the atonement, he ceased his ministration in the first apartment. So too, where did Christ go when he ascended? Did Jesus wait until 1844 to enter the most holy place? The biblical book of Hebrews tells a different story. When the book of Hebrews was written, approximately 64 AD, Jesus was in the presence of God. For Christ has not entered into the holy places made of hands, which are the figures of the true, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. Hebrews 9:24. Where is the presence of God? And the Lord said unto Moses, Speak unto Aaron thy brother, that he come not at all times into the holy place within the veil before the mercy seat, which is upon the ark, that he did not, for I will appear in the cloud upon the mercy seat. Leviticus 16:2. According to the earthly pattern of the tabernacle, the special place of the Lord's presence was upon the mercy seat in the most holy place. If the earthly pattern is the same in the heavenly, then in order for Christ to have entered the presence of God, he must have entered into the most holy place to appear before the mercy seat of God. So did Jesus open the way into the holiest upon his ascension, having therefore, brethren, boldness to enter the holiest by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way, which he hath consecrated for us? Hebrews 10:19-20. Let us therefore come boldly into the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy, and find grace to help in time of need. Hebrews 4:16. Jesus opened the way for believers to enter into the most holy place, so that we can bring our petitions directly to the throne of grace. The throne of grace is the mercy seat, the most holy place where the presence of God abides. So they ask, how could sinful humans have had access to the holiest for 1800 years prior to 1844 if Christ himself was not ministering in the holiest? And they have parallel passages here showing Christ fulfilled the Old Testament Day of Atonement at his ascension. If you want, just pause your screen. I'm actually not going to bother reading them. They go on to say, is there a literal veil in heaven? All of the items in the Old Testament tabernacle pointed to the ministry of Christ in the heavenly sanctuary. The veil itself was a symbol of Jesus. Having therefore, brethren, boldness to enter into the holiest by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way, which he hath consecrated for us through the veil, that is to say, his flesh, Hebrews 10:19-20. Jesus Christ is the veil. Note what happened when Christ died. And the veil of the temple was rent in twain from the top to the bottom, Mark 15:38. The tearing of the veil indicated that Christ had opened up the way to the most holy place. Christ himself is the veil that was rent, just as the Levitical priesthood ministered in the earthly tabernacle. The royal priesthood, 1 Peter 2:9, of believers has access to the heavenly tabernacle. Unlike the Levitical priesthood, however, the royal priesthood has direct access to the throne of grace through the new and living way that Christ has opened for us through the veil, which is his body. Therefore, we have access to the most holy place through Christ. The two-veil theory. Some Adventist scholars have claimed that when Jesus entered within the veil, he entered within the first veil which separated the outer court from the tabernacle. They say that there is a second veil in heaven which separates the two heavenly apartments, just as there was a veil separating the two earthly apartments. Their theory of a second veil in the heavenly sanctuary does not even stand up to the test of their own prophet, who said, "By the rending of the veil of the temple, God said, I can no longer reveal my presence in the most holy place. A new and living way, before which there hangs no veil, is offered to all." They try to say then, 3, that even Ellen White, in an odd statement, which seemingly contradicts what she wrote in the Great Controversy, admits there is no second veil in heaven. Jesus Christ is the veil in heaven. Of course, there's no place where they can show that quote, but okay, I guess we'll just take their word for it. Conclusion. There is not a single word in the New Testament indicating that Christ would move from the holy to the most holy place at a certain point in history. On the contrary, all the biblical evidence points to Christ fulfilling the Day of Atonement at his ascension. Christ came as a high priest to his temple. He entered by his own blood. He purified heavenly copies with his blood. He appeared before the presence of God. His blood cleanses people from sin. The atonement has been completed. At his ascension, Christ fulfilled every one of the aspects of the Day of Atonement as described. So that's what they're claiming. Notice in that last verse in Hebrews where it says, "He hath perfected forever them that are sanctified." Well, I wasn't alive when Jesus died, so how could I have been sanctified? And from my previous videos, we know that faith yields works, and we are judged by our works. So when does that happen if it already happened on the cross or at his ascension? They aren't just arguing the judgment didn't start in 1844. They're arguing that there is no judgment at all, which we kind of cleared up last week, that there is a judgment. And obviously the dead, when they die, are judged, and now he's in the judgment of the living. But now about the veil. The holy place was set apart, holy, because it was a special representation and reminder of the presence of God. At the back of the holy place was a smaller chamber called the Holy of Holies, or Most Holy Place. In this smaller room was the Ark of the Covenant. On top of the Ark was a special area called the Mercy Seat. Then this was seen as the throne of God. While God is omnipresent, this location was seen as a special place for God to dwell in the middle of his people. This second chamber could only be entered by the high priest on one day of the year, the Day of Atonement, and only with a blood sacrifice. The high priest would enter the most holy place with smoke from the altar of incense to help shield his view, and sprinkle blood on the Ark of the Covenant to atone for the sins of the people. Anyone who entered this chamber when he was not supposed to would be killed. The tabernacle and the temple emphasized the presence of God in the midst of his people. God was always there and accessible. At the same time, the holy place and the most holy place emphasized God's holiness and his inaccessibility due to the sins of the people. When Jesus died on the cross, 3 Gospels report that the curtain of the temple, that barrier between the holy place and most holy place, was supernaturally torn in two. See Matthew 27:51, Mark 15:38, or Luke 23:45. The torn curtain symbolized that the way to God was now open to all through the death of Christ. The blood of an animal was no longer needed. Hebrews 10:19-22 explains, "Therefore, brothers and sisters, since we have confidence to enter the most holy place by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way opened for us through the curtain, that is, his body, since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near to God with a sincere heart and with the full assurance that faith brings." See, now their argument is falsely claiming that Christ's death is the final atonement and judgment for sins. The veil being torn showed the ultimate sacrifice had been made, and there was no longer an earthly mediator in the Jewish priests. It's not that mediation had ended. John 14:6 says, "Jesus saith unto him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father, but by me." If we were already covered by Christ's death, why do we need to come to the Father and do it through Jesus? As we debunked last week, the argument in 1:1 about the final judgment, and we find there is a judgment, Daniel and Revelation come together to confirm this, and confirm that it started in 1844. When you look at all their arguments against Ellen White together, you realize they're not arguing against her. They're arguing against biblical prophecy and misinterpreting the death of Christ and even the stations of the tabernacle. The death of Christ was the sacrifice on the altar in the courtyard. He still had to move into the most holy place where his Father sits on the mercy seat to present himself as a living sacrifice for our sins. They aren't just twisting Ellen White, they're twisting the whole plan of salvation. We have been called into the most holy place with him, and we are called to dwell in the Ark of the Covenant where God is seated. Like Noah called people into the Ark, 1844 and the 3 angels' message is our final call for this generation to come into the Ark and to live holy lives with Christ and rediscover the 10 Commandments, especially the 4th command that is contained within the Ark of the Covenant. Satan is the accuser of the brethren and is accusing us right now. Let's stand with Christ, accepting his perfect and blameless sacrifice, that by accepting we may be changed into his likeness, and may be counted worthy to stand among the few. The final argument for today, which is from a different page on the site, is kind of silly, but I have talked about obelisks, so let's check it out really quick. Here you can see them making all the arguments against idols and pagan symbols from the Bible and God's instructions to the Israelites, and yet there is an obelisk on the White family grave. And it's good to be mindful of these things, but we have to be careful, although, it may not be the best choice in imagery, as has been pointed out. I feel this is kind of one of those nitpicky arguments, but I like the way it is stated here. Question: is Ellen White's grave really an Egyptian obelisk? Also, she uses the phrase all-seeing eye in her writings. The all-seeing eye is an ancient pagan symbol and a Freemason symbol. Does this mean that Ellen White was a Freemason and Baal worshipper? Answer: we must not look only at the symbols around a person, but what they teach and how they live. Take Robert Schuller, for example. We don't look only at the symbols around him, but what he teaches. Robert Schuller teaches Masonic doctrine. If you need proof, please watch the presentation That All May Be One on AmazingDiscoveries.tv. There are some who say that since Ellen White has an obelisk on her gravestone, she must have been involved in the Masons. Our response is simply this: did Ellen White teach Masonic doctrine? The obvious answer to that question is no. She constantly indicts Freemasons and secret societies in her writings. Each time she mentions them, she indicates that those who belong to such orders will be lost. In fact, that in and of itself validates her prophetic gift. Do Ellen White's statements make us think that she is a Freemason? No. Does she recommend people become Freemasons? No. Check out her thoughts on secret societies on page 16 of this newsletter. We can't assume she was a Mason or a Baal worshiper solely because she has an obelisk on her grave. Obelisks were a standard for gravestones during the time she lived. In fact, they were one of the cheaper options. You can read more about gravestone use in the U.S. here. An Association for Gravestone Studies, and more about the use of obelisks as gravestones is on a second site, if you're interested. Ellen White certainly had nothing to do with the obelisk on her own grave. In the 1800s, obelisks were a very common grave marker. We do not judge Ellen White, or anyone else for that matter, solely on a symbol or sign that might be placed on their tomb, or even on certain terms or words they might use that might be associated with Freemasonry. We judge them according to their theology. Ellen White's theology supports the Bible, supporting link in the article. When Ellen White used the phrase all-seeing eye, she was not referring to the New Age or pagan symbol. God's eye does see everything, and that's what she means by this statement. Don't forget that Lucifer's original and continuing plan is to be like the Most High. He was the covering cherub. He knows what God is like. So to be like him, Lucifer would want to use symbols that mimic God. We must be careful about becoming overzealous about symbols. Symbols are useful, but the devil uses many innocent symbols that people might use unknowingly simply because they exist. God made triangles, circles, shells, and the colors red and purple. Just because the devil has taken symbols over does not mean that we may never use them. As Walter Byth once said, I drive a Volkswagen which has a pagan symbol, and I use it to do the Lord's work. The devil must really hate that. It's true that symbols can often point us to areas where something isn't right, or can help us see connections we couldn't see otherwise. So if we suspect something isn't right based on the symbolism, it's important that we go deeper and explore the theology of the person in question. But it's at the theological level that we must determine the soundness of a person's message. There is a marked difference between Ellen White's writings and those of Albert Pike and others who write about Masonic doctrine. Check out this website, which responds to the false accusation against Ellen White, where Bob Pickle obliterates allegations against Ellen White. He shows that most of the charges against her are blatant lies, and that the rest twist what she actually said. For his church, in every generation, God has a special truth and a special work. The truth that is hid from the worldly wise and prudent is revealed to the childlike and humble. It calls for self-sacrifice, has battles to fight and victories to win. The outset its advocates are few. By the great men of the world, and by a world-conforming church, they are opposed and despised. Ellen White. So I hope as we go through these arguments, you're able to come to have a better understanding of the opposition. Not just Ellen White and the faithful few, but most of all the Bible and God himself is up against. May you all be blessed. See you next Sabbath. Please feel free to share thoughts and suggestions or any points I missed that should be included. I know there's a lot of arguments left out that I could have included for the sake of time, but I hope you study the plan of salvation for yourselves and see the truth. Don't forget to check the description for some great links and a downloadable PDF. Much love to you all.